Okay, we are live. We usually give it just a minute or so for people to start hopping on to get going here, but we can start off. So again, welcome to Wisconsin Right Now podcast. Jim Pivovarchuk, Jessica McBride, and we are joined today with our special guest Brian Reisinger. Brian, we've gotten to know Brian over the years with our work at Wisconsin Right Now. Brian's has quite a bit of experience as a journalist, a speechwriter. I think you're a strategist on Capitol Hill and across the United States. Brian's a columnist. He's done articles for Milwaukee Journal Sentinel. Let's see, USA Today, Newsweek, Yahoo News, PBS Wisconsin, Game and Fish Magazine, Real Clear Politics, The Hill. So Brian, you really have a lot of experience when it comes to writing and being a columnist. So welcome.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate you guys having me on.
Let me get started. So we want to have you on because you recently just wrote a book. And I'm going to add a link to it so people can take a look at it. The book is called Land Rich, Cash Poor. Brian, you're a fourth generation farmer. Grew up on a farm in Sauk County. Sauk County would be kind of in the southwestern part of Wisconsin. I think it's like Baraboo, Wisconsin Dells area. So you grew up on a farm there. So why don't you take it with it? Tell us what inspired you to write this book.
Yeah, well, I'm like you guys. I'm not busy enough. Farm boys like to have a couple things to do, and so I needed a side project. But in seriousness, I grew up on a farm, as you said, working with my dad from the time I could walk, and for as long as I can remember understanding words. So I don't know, 3-4 years old, I remember understanding that farms were going by the wayside. Some of them, you'd have guys drive into my dad's driveway and say, "Oh, this farm went under, or that farm sold to so-and-so." And that's been going on for as long as I can recall. And so I grew up knowing that I was really lucky to have grown up on a farm in southern Wisconsin. And I just always kind of wondered, why is it that this is a rare way of life? What's happening? And as I got older and I pursued a career off the farm in business journalism first, and then in public policy, as you said, I saw that we really have an economy that's been leaving our farms behind. And we have a political system that's been stamping our farms out. And I saw that up close. And so I thought that it was time that somebody tried to answer the question of why. And so what we do with Land Rich, Cash Poor is we take hidden areas of history driving the disappearance of our farms, and I weave that with my family's story over 4 generations from the Great Depression to today. And so we try to tell a personal story and some of that human drama about what our family has contended with, and the weather and the farm accidents and all of the harrowing experiences that a farm family has, and all the beauty that a farm family experiences too. And we try to weave that in with all the forces, economic, social, political, technological, that have been wiping out our farms, and try to figure out what's going on and talk about the consequences, because this is something that affects not only rural America, but it's a type of hollowing out of rural America that affects the entire country, because it affects our food supply and so many other issues that we could get into. So that's what we're trying to do with the book, and I hope we've accomplished it.
So Brian, can you tell us some of the whys? Because I've heard this as well for years, right? We all know that the family farm is quote unquote dying. Can you tell us the reasons that that's happening, and also the current trends and some of the statistics? Like, what's the recent trend with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So the big reasons, there's 4 major buckets. I mentioned economic. That's because there have been economic crises in our country, but when it comes to farming, we really almost always have handled those economic crises wrong. We didn't understand that the Great Depression was hitting farmers earlier and in a unique way. We didn't realize that good times like the 50s and 60s were actually creating a situation where the farmer was more and more the little guy compared to big business and big government. In the 1980s, with the farm crisis, we didn't realize that we were kicking off basically a depression just specifically for rural communities that was going to wipe out tens of thousands of farms. We didn't understand globalization. We didn't understand what the recessions of the 2000s were doing. So when there's bad times and there's good times in the American economy, but we have so often, time and again, had the bad times be worse than they needed to be, and the good times not as good as they could have been, because we haven't understood what's happening to our farmers. That's the economic. Social, there's natural forces. There's people who are moving from rural areas to urban areas decades upon decades. I'm an example of that. I'm somebody who's gone back and forth between the rural and urban economy as I've tried to find my way. And the reality is that so much of that has happened that we lost so much of our rural workforce, and that ended up having a lasting impact as well. Technological, we have a situation where our technology over time began to tilt more and more against small and mid-sized farms, making it so that really the technological innovation really only catered to the larger farms. And we can talk about, good or bad of all different types of sizes of farms, but the point is that so much of our technological innovation has been leaving farms behind needlessly. They might be just as efficient and just as competitive other than just their size, and the technology hasn't been there to provide the same kind of innovation for those farms, and that's been going on for decades too. And then political, and I'm sure we'll get into that, but the reality is that we have government policies that have been stamping out our farmers for decades, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly. So what this all nets out to is we've lost 45,000 farms per year on average for a century. And the more recent trend is we're continuing to lose farms. And, the inflation that affected so many families so negatively the last couple of years affects farmers too. They're facing the same kind of crunch, and it makes worse the crunch they're always facing, which is the costs of production, seed, fertilizer, fuel, energy, all that is going up. And the price that they get for the crops and products is jumping around, maybe sometimes up, sometimes down, but it's never keeping pace with those increasing costs. And so that's how the farmer ends up getting squeezed and grinding out a living harder and harder every year.
If you could wave your magic wand and change one governmental regulation to help alleviate this crisis, what would that be?
That's such a good question. If I could wave my magic wand, I would make it so that our farm programs perform their basic function and allow entrepreneurial activity and the market to let farmers figure out what it is that consumers want. And what I mean by that is we've had decade upon decade upon decade of government programs piled one on top of one another. And you can talk about and debate whether one program's, good or bad. And, you can have that discussion. That's not the discussion that we're having in this country. What we're doing is continue to pile program after program, and we don't know if they're working. A lot of times they contradict one another. And it takes, an army of accountants and tax attorneys and lobbyists to figure out how to navigate them. And that's even before you get into the fact that over time, as you guys know, being investigative journalists, government is prone to abuse and favoritism over the years, So there's a reason that you can find almost everybody hates something about our farm program here in this country, whether they're on the right or the left, whether they're inside farming, outside farming. Everybody has something they don't like. And that's because it's just become this big Frankenstein over the decades rather than us fully reforming it. So if I could wave a wand, it would be that we roll up our sleeves and we have a government that actually fully reforms these programs and figures out, what baseline kind of safety net do you need around factors like uncontrollable weather to make sure that we have a stable food supply. But from there, how can we allow farmers to pursue economic opportunity that's going to fulfill the need that consumers have, rather than government programs directing so much of what is going on?
Yeah, I just want to give a story, a personal story of my own here. I'm a real estate broker, and I have been involved in the sale of many farms here in Washington County. And one in particular stands out, a farmer. It's been in his family for multi generations also. And he got to the point where he was a dairy farmer, several hundred cows, and they could not get anyone to come and pick up their milk. The companies in the area here would not pick up his milk. So every morning he had to go and dump thousands of gallons of raw milk into his fields. And he's like, so I'm not getting paid for that. I have to dump all this milk. I can't tell the cows to stop producing milk. They're going to keep on producing milk. I have to feed them. And one thing that I think a lot of people don't realize are the vet bills that are involved, right? And you know how expensive it is right now if you have a dog to get basic treatment for a dog. Imagine having 300 cows and all the vet bills involved with that. And he showed me some of those bills, and that was that was amazing. And then he also talked about how he might get, and I'm just paraphrasing his ideas, like maybe he would get 50 cents a gallon for milk, and then the stores and everyone else was making a ton of money off of his raw milk, and he was making almost nothing. So that's why these farms, at least in Washington County, were having to close up.
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. I mean, one of the issues that we have is that there just are not enough avenues for farmers to be able to sell their goods and products. And that's true of existing products like milk, and that's true of new products. If we want our farmers to be pursuing new types of crops and products that can supply our food economy at a time when people are interested in knowing what they're putting in their bodies, knowing where their food is coming from more than ever. But farmers are really locked into certain types of situations. In some cases, it's because there's government subsidy that makes a certain type of crop a little steadier. And so people feel like they've got to kind of grow that. But at the same time, it's not a good enough opportunity to really be a good, solid living, unless you get really, 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 really big. And the other thing is there aren't enough avenues even for established forms of farming like dairy farming. I'll give you, an example that really fits with what you're talking about. We were lucky. The farm that I grew up on, we had local small cheese factory we sold the farm to, and we sold our milk to. And we still have the farm in our family, but we sold our milk to this local cheese factory, and they were really involved in specialty cheeses, and they made all kinds of different things that they really were sought after by consumers. So they were able to pay a couple more pennies on the dollar to my dad, and that was something that allowed us to keep going for a long time. But there's very, very fewer of those. I mean, it's better in Wisconsin than a lot of states, but it's getting less and less. And so what you have is you have farmers that they may only have one place they could sell their milk, and it was probably to a great big dairy processor. That the reality is that those guys, they have to decide what's economical for them to take on versus not. And if they can't take on your milk because it's not economical for them to do it,
Right.
the farmer doesn't have anywhere to sell their milk, and they can't expand their herd. They can't sell what they got. They can't do the things that they want to do to pursue more economic opportunity because there aren't enough places in our supply chain. And so we've got this really integrated food system that means that there's limited places for farmers to sell their goods. And it means that there's, only a few ways really that food gets from the farm gate to the dinner table when you get down to it. And that not only causes some of the issues that you're observing there in Washington County, Jim, but, think about COVID. Remember, whether it was the spread of the virus or whether it was the government's reaction to it, the things that happened to the industries that were in our supply chain was really tragic. And you would have a big distribution center, a big food processing center go down, and it would have a huge impact on the food supply. And that's because our industries are so integrated that, there aren't as many paths for the food to get from the farmer to the consumer. And so you have the supply chain that in some ways is a modern miracle, getting any kind of food to any part of the country. And in other ways is really deeply vulnerable. And so our supply chain locked up, and, consumers will remember, families in Wisconsin remember what it was like. You couldn't find what you needed in the grocery store. And if you could, it was more expensive. Well, at the same time that was happening, farmers couldn't sell their goods. And if they could, it was for lower prices. So how do you have consumers paying higher prices and not finding what they need, and farmers desperately trying to sell their goods and not being able to get a good price for it? It's because that supply chain was locked up. And this doesn't happen only in COVID. It's bird flu, it's weather, uncontrollable disaster. It happens all the time. And that's why our food prices, one of the reasons our food prices are so high, and the reason they rose so much faster than the rate of inflation, and it was so much worse. Part of the reason for that is the vulnerability to our supply chain. And that ties back in part to all the farms we've wiped out.
I think you sort of just answered this, but for people watching this who aren't farmers, maybe they even live in urban areas, how does this affect them directly? I assume
Yeah.
food prices and inflation, because of what you just said. Are there other things that, reasons that they should care? They should just care because we care about family farms, but like, how is this having a direct impact on everybody?
It's such an important question because there's so many things going on in rural America that maybe people care about for an emotional reason, which I'm glad they do, but not all of those things have an impact on the rest of the country. This one does, and the first is food prices. As we have, farmers don't make more money, by the way, when food prices are high, because food is bought and sold by people in between the farmer and the consumer, and there's only a small piece of that goes back to the farmer. And at the same time that the consumer is facing higher prices, the farmer is facing higher prices too. So the farmer faces the same crunch as the consumer, doesn't put more money in their pocket when the consumer's paying more for food. But the way we're wiping out our farms contributes to this shaky supply chain that is a miracle, but is also kind of deeply vulnerable. And so when that supply chain locks up, that shoots food prices up. So that's one way it's tied to it. Another is you can't hammer an innovation. You can't hammer an industry like we have been and not have innovation suffer. And so innovation has long been a big part of American agriculture, but it's suffering now, and it's leaving a lot of farmers behind because you can't beat on an industry like that and expect it to operate at its best. And so we're getting less productive, less efficient. And it's also contributing toward higher prices. Then you get into the health of our food. There's a lot of people questioning what's for dinner, wanting to know what they're putting in their bodies. is the overly processed food that we have good for us, you know? And that's tied to this issue too, because it's harder and harder to provide the kinds of choices and the kinds of local, fresh, regional options and the specialty foods that people want as alternatives if we're wiping out all these farms. Then you get into mental health. We have a mental health crisis in this country. People from all walks of life suffer from mental health issues, and farming is one of the biggest contributors to that because of the pressure that people face to try to keep the farm going generation after generation. And then you can get into right or left. Folks on the left who care about the environment, it is a bigger challenge to solve any environmental issues that we'd want to work together on because of the way we're wiping out our family farms. You get into national security. Folks who are concerned about the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, the reality is that the Chinese are working hard to purchase as much farmland as they can. And the amount of land owned by foreign countries went up by 15% in just 2 years. It's still a fairly small amount, but it's shooting upward and it's really freaking people out. And they're buying farmland also near military installations. And we know that's not a coincidence. And so when you have farms getting wiped out and you have this farmland being held by fewer and fewer farms and sometimes held by companies, you know, some of these companies, they're just trying to satisfy their shareholders. So they'll turn around and sell it to the Chinese or the North Koreans or the Iranians. You know, try walking up to our farm and asking my dad to sell his farm to the Chinese Communist Party. It's not happening, you know? So if we preserve small land ownership by a lot of landowners in this country, it's a guard against that. So whether it's our food prices, our economy, our culture, environmental issues, if that's what you care about, national security, if that's what you care about, wiping out these farms is affecting so many issues. And I tell people it's because it's not just the farms that feed us, it's a part of ourselves. You know, farming is so woven into who we are as a country that when you dismantle that, a lot of things go haywire.
So, Brian, let's talk a little bit about the current political environment. Obviously, we had I think we all can agree it was a terrific victory a couple weeks ago. How do you see the Trump administration, and maybe even I'd be interested in your thoughts on RFK, joining the team? What do you see? What do you think the future is going to be for farming now with the Trump administration?
Yeah. Well, of course, there's a lot of people in farm country that supported President Trump, and there's a lot of people in rural areas that are excited about his election and what he's going to do. And that's true. It is also true that these issues set in over many decades, you know, a century. And I just try to be honest with people, including, you know, friends I've got on the right, friends I've got who have different persuasions. I say, you know, when you look back at the history that I looked at for the book, the reality is that the establishment of both parties have failed on this issue at different points in the past century, you know, and so it took both parties to break it. It's going to take a long time for us to really completely pull out of it. That said, President Trump did talk a lot about trying to figure out ways to reduce costs for farmers. He talks a lot about tax cuts and deregulation, you know, putting more money in farmers' pockets. That's something farmers like. Talks about deregulation, trying to reduce the costs and being able to operate. That's something that farmers like. So those are all very, very good things. Farmers are also very supportive of, and I don't, you know, profess to speak for all farmers. It's just, this is what I see out there and the folks that I talk to, and you see it in polling and things too. They're also very supportive of getting tough with China, because buying up foreign farmland is not the only way that the American farmer has seen the Chinese screwing over our country. You know, they've dealt with the fact that the Chinese have bought massive amounts of agricultural goods for years and years and years to kind of get a captive market. And then they dump it and they stop buying and they screw with the price, you know. And there's a lot of farmers who've seen their prices plummet because of games that the Chinese are playing, on top of the way that China cheats on trade standards and all kinds of stuff. So they're very supportive of getting tough with China. It's also a complicated picture for farmers, and I think we got to be honest about that. And I try to be straightforward about it, because they support, many of them, getting tough on China. And part of that is tariffs as a negotiating tool. At the same time, if the situation were to spin out of control and you start having tariffs getting slapped on in all kinds of different directions by all kinds of different countries, there are farmers who are selling goods not only in America, but also to other countries, that will see the price of their goods in those countries go up because of tariffs from other countries. And that makes it harder for them to sell their goods, and they will see their businesses get harmed in a big way. And so, you know, farmers, I think, both support getting tough with China and understand that tariffs are an element of that. But I think also many of them deal with the complicated picture of, we need to make sure we craft those policies in a way that gets tough with China, make sure we got fair standards, but doesn't spin into a situation where it makes it harder for them to sell their goods. And so it's important to work to get that policy right.
What to what degree is China and Iran and other foreign countries, to what degree are they buying up farmland in Wisconsin?
That's a good question. I don't know the state specific statistics. I do know that there's something like 350,000 acres that the Chinese own in terms of American farmland. And I know that there is a lot of discussion of foreign investment in Wisconsin around farmland, and you will find different opinions on the issue of like friendly countries investing. So you will have some farmers and some industries in Wisconsin, some parts of the agriculture industry, who will say that having people from friendly countries, business interests from friendly countries coming in to invest is an important source of investment for their industries. Other farmers would never dream of bringing in foreign investment around their land or around their operations. But I think what most people agree with is that the effort by foreign adversaries to come in and buy our land is a real problem and a real concern. I don't know what the breakdown is in Wisconsin, but given how quickly and rapidly it's been increasing and how alarming that is, I think it's something we need to be concerned about in Wisconsin. We are lucky that in our state we have more small farms than a lot of other places. Wisconsin is still, by and large, a source of the small and medium-sized farms, the family farm, as well as larger farms that have been able to get bigger and survive by getting bigger and achieve economics of scale. A lot of other states have lost their farm sectors, and Wisconsin's has been more durable. But at the same time, in my dad's generation, from the time my dad took over the farm to the time that he began to pass it along to our generation, my sister is working to take over the farm from him. During that time frame, Wisconsin went from number one in milk production to number one in farm bankruptcies. So we've got more durability in Wisconsin to guard against the Chinese coming in and buying, because we got more small landowners spread out all over the state. Makes it harder for the Chinese to do that. But at the same time, we're facing a really stark decline. And so if it's been more challenging for foreign adversaries to come here and buy our farmland, it's getting easier by the year,
Brian, can you, I'm interested to know, what products do our farms in America ship over to countries like China that would be subjected to those tariffs?
Yeah, that's a great question. What the tariffs would apply to would depend upon what our country does and what the other countries do to react to it. But what I can tell you is that the products that we sell over there, there's a lot of soybeans sold to China. There's a lot of commodity crops, corn, a lot of grains, all those kind of big commodity crops that you would think of. And it's really interesting that you ask about that, because we had a time in our history where we actually could have diversified our farm economy and maybe saved some farms and kept ourselves from being so captive to China. And that was in the 90s and early 2000s. We had a growing specialty food market. What I mean by that is there's commodity products like corn and soybeans and kind of your standard stuff that is sold on the big global market, and it's sold like any other commodity, like gold, silver, anything else. And then there's a specialty food market, and that's where you got farms that are growing maybe a special type of corn that's used in corn tortillas, or growing certain types of specialty wheat that are used in, particular types of bread, milk that goes towards specialty cheeses, like I mentioned earlier. There was a growing specialty food sector in our economy that was creating more and more opportunity for farmers that might be growing some commodity crops, but might also be growing some types of food or raising some types of livestock that contribute towards specialty foods. And we had more of that happening. And what happened is when the Great Recession hit, prices went down in the basement, and our country responded by just trying to figure out desperately where we could sell anything. You're just trying to kind of recover your prices. Well, China was more than happy to come in and scoop up all that. So they started buying more and more and more of our goods. And so in a farm economy that had some bulk commodities and some specialty food markets, what ended up happening is it really went out of whack, and the specialty food markets kind of collapsed, and we started doing more and more just straight commodities selling in places like China. So we became bigger captives of China after the Great Recession. And those are the types of crops that are sold there. And the reality is that a lot of farmers are still growing those because they can sell it and it gets bought on the global market, because government subsidies support those types of crops. Because if they wanted to grow something different, they wouldn't have anywhere to take it. A farmer knows where to take their corn or their soybeans here in Wisconsin. You take the local grain elevator to the co-op, but they don't necessarily have a place. If you want to grow specialty tomatoes or garlic, where do they sell that? And that's because we don't have an economy that's arranged to buy a lot of food from farmers locally. And we can make changes, and that's part of the answer. And that's part of what people who want to change our food economy are trying to do. But, the reality is that farmers right now are kind of locked into bad options because there isn't a lot of that's happening.
Can you talk more about your family farm history? It goes back, you said, what, 100 years, 4 generations. Can you talk about like the first family farmer in your family history and walk us
Yeah.
to the present?
I'm amazed what farm families go through, and our family is no different. The difference between our family and so many other farm families is that my dad and different generations of our family agreed to help me tell our story, but it's amazing what farm families live through. So my great grandpa, Alice Reisinger, came over from Bavaria. He and my great grandmother escaped pre-World War I Europe. He had served in the military, and he knew he wanted to come to America instead to pursue a better life. So he came here, and they started digging their living out of the dirt in 1912. And they survived subsistence farming, and they were really able to be successful entrepreneurial. It was a hard life, but there was a lot of economic opportunity at the time. And then they hit the Depression. And my grandpa, as well as my grandma, grew up in the Great Depression. And there were 2 decades of poverty because the Depression hit farm country a decade earlier, something I found when I was investigating this for the book. And so my grandpa grew up in 2 decades of poverty, climbed into the middle class, taken over the farm from my great grandpa in the 1940s and 50s. And then my dad took over the farm from my grandpa in the 1970s. My mom and dad were married in 1976. They had to survive a drought their first year. Some reason my mom still married him. And, they sailed into the farm crisis, and they survived the farm crisis in the 1980s that wiped out tens of thousands of farms. And that brought us to the current generation. My sister and I grew up living through what globalization was doing, what the recessions of the 2000s did to farms, what COVID did to farms. And so, that's really where this story began for me. I wanted to just, tell those stories about what it is that our family has survived over the 4 generations to show what farm families deal with. And what I found is I wanted to do that while answering the question, why are our farms disappearing? And the part that was dumb luck on my part is I found that the stories that our family was living out over the generations lined up with these huge trends and forces that were kind of attacking and stamping out the family farm. And so we found that a lot of our story tracks what was happening with that broader history that I think a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of. So that was interesting, but that's kind of our family story. And I was just sort of fortunate that it tracked with, the bigger forces at play.
My ancestors were Bavarian farmers as well, who
Is
came
that
to
right? No
Wisconsin.
kidding.
Yeah. I stayed on the family hops farm in Augsburg, in the area of Augsburg, Germany, at one point in college.
Oh,
But it was
that's cool.
run by my great great grandfather, who then came to Wisconsin. But then they weren't
Wow.
farmers after that. So it's probably a common immigration story to Wisconsin to have German heritage.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yep.
Can you tell us
Absolutely.
about your current family farm? Like what do you farm? And I noticed
Yeah.
that you go back and forth between Northern California and your family farm.
Yeah.
Is it in Sauk County? Do I have that right? Sauk
Yep.
County?
That's right.
Yeah, and
Yep.
so tell us
Yep.
about all that.
Yeah, absolutely. So our farm was a dairy farm for more than 100 years. And I was lucky we grew up with a middle class living. It was one that we saw slipping away. And I was lucky that my parents were able to help me get through college. I worked my way through college writing for newspapers and with help from my parents. And I was the first in our family to go to college. And I was also the first in our family in 4 generations of eldest sons not take over the farm. And that was something that was hard for me to deal with. It just wasn't my gift. But I'm grateful to say that my sister had more talent for crops and cattle than I did. So she's working with my dad, taking over the farm. And in 2021, the economics got so tough for a small dairy farm. We had 50 cows, which had gone from being kind of average size to like minuscule. And we either could get bigger, which is an option, or we could diversify. So my dad decided to sell the cows and diversify. So now what my dad and sister do is they raise cows for other dairy herds. So they raise heifers that become milk cows on other dairies. They raise beef for consumers, and they raise cash crops. And they're constantly working to figure out how can we diversify? What else do we want to try to grow? What do we want to try to experiment with? And, farm kids don't really get a day off. So I help out on the business side of the farm. And when I'm home, they throw me in a tractor too. But I'm really just kind of proud and grateful to see that they're working to carry it on. And so we're an example of this trend. ongoing. We're kind of living it, trying to make sure that the farm can make it. And as for me, with my career being off the farm, it can kind of be from anywhere. Why would a farm boy from Sauk County go to California of all places is a great question. And the only answer is, things we do for love. So my wife is from Northern California, and she got a chance to have a job out there, and my work can be from anywhere. So we went out there, and I go back and forth. I'm back to Wisconsin nearly monthly, as you said, split my time. And when I'm in Wisconsin, I live out at the family farm. And so I'm grateful for that. And it's a chance in my work and my writing and also with our little girl to have her out and know the farm, know her cousins, know her grandparents. And so I'm grateful to be back as often as I am and to go back and forth. It's a little bit of a hectic life. I also got to say, people say, how can you afford two places? I really can't. We can't even afford a place in California. We're renting right now. And then I'm lucky to just, be able to live out at the family farm with my parents, which is kind of a special thing. So.
Brian, could you touch on the mental health issues with farmers? The suicide rates, I believe, are higher than the average national statistics. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's such a crucial issue. I appreciate you asking about it. Farming is consistently in the top 3 of suicide rates in the country. And the reason for that is you have these people who are so devoted to this way of life, and it's getting harder and harder and harder to make a living each year. And, when you grow up on a farm, it's not just your mom or dad's job, it's your home, it's your community, it's your heritage. And so you have people who are finding that it is harder and harder each year to make a living, and they can either hold on and maybe face the day where they can't provide for their family, or they can sell and turn around and lose everything else. And people have to make decisions, and families decide every day to sell their land, and that they have to do what's right for them. But there are a lot of people who end up having to sell when they wish they didn't have to, and so that kind of emotional pressure is really, really challenging. And when you grow up on a farm, you also kind of are taught to kind of put your head down and get the work done, and so all that pressure of whether you're going to fail economically and whether you're going to fail, after 4, 5, 6 generations of your family before you making it, great grandpa, survived war, or grandpa survived the Depression. Why can't I make it, kind of thing? So there's a lot of pressure, and farm families traditionally don't talk about it. And so there really is a kind of a silent mental health crisis going on. We talk about it some in the book. After we sold the cows, even though we were carrying the farm forward, I remember standing on my cabin porch back in the woods behind the farmhouse with my dad. It was a beautiful day, and we had a lot of hope about what we were going to do in the future. But there were dark storm clouds for him, and he was tearful, and I remember wondering if he was having thoughts about harming himself. And in the course of interviewing him for the book, I learned that he was. And I'm grateful to say that my dad is okay. He came out of that by thinking about the next generation, thinking about his grandkids, and we're so grateful for that. And I'm so proud that he's here with us, and still, if it was daytime, he'd be on the back of a tractor right now, and he loves our way of life. But we talked long and hard about whether we wanted to share that. And we decided, and we do in the opening pages of chapter 1, and we decided that we needed to. My dad said, I want people to know about that because I want them to know that they're not on their own, so we try to tell people that there's strength, not shame, in speaking up. And, mental health is something that only gets dealt with if you address it, but there are so many people who suffer with that and don't feel they can speak up.
Yeah.
What's your dad's name?
Jim.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Good name.
So what's he doing now?
Yep. Yeah. So he's 72, and he's been working, excuse me. He's been working hard on the farm since he was 8 years old, and he's still hard at it. And so my dad and mom still own it, and my sister is working to take it over. And so they're raising heifers together. They're raising beef cattle, and they're cash cropping. And he just got done with harvest, and he was on the back of the tractor into the wee hours of the night. And like I say, when I come home, I try to help and pitch in because he's getting up there in years, but he thrives on the work too, So, I mean, it's really hard physically, but it keeps him young also.
Yeah.
I know Jim touched on this, but we didn't go too deep into it. What's your opinion of the MAHA movement and what RFK Jr. is trying to raise about preservatives and chemicals and additives, all that in food, and how that links back to your concerns and the issues in your book?
Yeah, absolutely. we're at a place where people care more about where their food comes from than ever before. And people are worried about what they're putting in their bodies more than ever before. And so in a lot of ways, that's an opportunity for farmers, because we can have farmers growing more types of food, more types of fresh food, selling into new types of markets because there's growing demand. And we have all these farms that are still there that are trying to figure out a path forward. And we have all these consumers and people who want a different type of food source. So there's got to be a way we can do something about that, right? And so I think that, his nomination, I don't know where that's going to go or what's going to happen. I mean, I don't have a crystal ball, but I will say that, the energy behind that issue shows that there are people of all kinds of different political persuasions who care about what they're putting in their bodies. And so there's a lot of energy around that. And, the thing that I think about is we've lost 70% of our farms in the past century, which is crazy, but we've got nearly 2 million left. And people are surprised when I tell them this, but 96% of them are family farms, 88% of them are small farms. People say, how can there be nearly 2 million small farms left? I thought they're all getting wiped out. Well, they are getting wiped out, but there's a lot of farms left. And Jim, I'm sure you see this as you deal with farmers and landowners in your business. It's not a full-time income for them. They're running the farm and they're also working factory shifts or construction sites or pouring concrete or have another small business or, working for another local farmer while they're also working their own land, whatever the case may be. And so what if we had a world where we could have new entrepreneur opportunity for our farmers, where they could have full-time family income off their farms again by growing new types of food for the American public, and the American public could have more choices, more fresh local options in addition to what they have now. That's a world that we could have if we make some changes. And so I think there's a lot of potential right now. The one thing that I do think is important is that we got to understand that if we're going to change things and we're going to have farms growing more types of food for people and more specialty foods, more local fresh foods, we have to remember that farms are small businesses. And so when we're crafting policies to try to steer things in that direction, it costs money for a farm that's growing corn and soybeans to turn around and try a new crop. They got to spend money on that seed. They're gambling whether it's going to work. They are already on tight margins. They don't have money setting aside. They don't have capital setting aside to make some investment, and so they want to do it. And there are farms that are working to transition, but we have to understand that they're small businesses, and that if we don't craft the policies right and we don't let them do it in a way that makes sense for them economically, we'll wipe out more farms. And so I think there's a lot of excitement, and it's all about, can we craft the policies to harness that excitement in a way that allows farms to, make that transition like any small business would need to.
Now, while you're talking, it occurs to me that RFK Jr. and Trump and all this MAHA stuff is very much focused right now, at least the narrative in the media, and I guess their narrative is focused on the end point, what's in the food that we buy at the grocery store and stick in our mouths or whatever.
Yeah.
They're not really
Yeah.
linking it back to the farms, to the beginning point. Does that make sense? Wouldn't it be great if that
Yeah.
movement sort of pulled that part in more?
Yeah, I think if we can, I think it's emblematic of a challenge we have in general in our country, which is that we've just moved to a place where fewer people are on farms or, as recently descended from farms as they once were. And so it's hard in our public policy debates to connect what's going on with our food to what's going on with our farms. And the reality is that they're very connected, but the policy connection isn't naturally there. So I hope that we can work to make sure that what we're doing with our food ties back to the realities that our farmers are facing on the ground. I think that would be a good thing, and it would be a way to make sure that this movement goes in a good direction.
Brian, what government regulations would you like to see loosened up, either state or federal? Do you think need to be loosened up? I'm thinking the DNR too, as a state DNR imposing unrealistic policies against farmers. How would you like to see any changes with that?
You're not going to get me going on the DNR right before deer hunting, are you? No, Wisconsin does pretty well because of the importance of agriculture in our state. Federally, there's a lot of costs around compliance that are meant for big farms that end up creating costs for small farms. There's a lot of issues around water and other things that, we all want fresh, clean water. But the reality of, the way that they're trying to regulate some of the big farms can be a danger to some of the smaller farms. So there's all kinds of things. But the big thing that I think I would want to do is see if we can a way to address the death tax. You have farms, and I know that's a little bit different than your question about regulatory stuff, but it's an important thing where you have farms that are going to get passed from one generation to the next. And if mom and dad die before that transition's figured out and there wasn't plans for how to deal with it, boy, a farm that was taxed by property taxes, by income taxes, is now going to get taxed on inheritance. And, that's the kind of thing that can crush a farm going from one generation to the next, because the kids can't afford to pay for it, so they have to sell it to pay off the taxes. So it's things like that I think are really, really problematic,
So we came to know you through a different sphere, not farms, but politics.
Yeah.
And since a lot of people watching this will be from the conservative world of politics, can you give people just a quick primer on what you've done in that arena? Like, you have this other
Sure.
side or other
Yeah.
world.
Yeah, absolutely. So, after growing up on the farm, I went and I worked in journalism for 10 years. I did investigative journalism, business journalism, and then I ended up working on Capitol Hill. I got recruited to work for Senator Lamar Alexander of Tennessee, and I worked for him on Capitol Hill, and then I worked on his campaigns and was his communications director and spokesman in 2014. And then I came back to Wisconsin, and I did the same thing for Senator Ron Johnson in 2016. And so I was his communications director then. And after that, I started my own business. I was doing some political consulting and then some consulting on issues that didn't have to do with partisan stuff. And I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do and try to move on from some of that stuff, because it is it's such a grind of a way of life. Although you do get the chance to work on some really interesting things. I worked for Governor Walker in that time when I had a mix of clients. I got the chance to work for the governor, which was an incredible opportunity. Worked for him for a number of years and was a senior advisor to him. And then after that, I really transitioned into more fully the day job that I have now, which is we still consult on messaging and we work with the media and all of that sort of stuff. And we work on crisis issues and public affairs, but it's for private sector companies and it's for nonpartisan organizations and think tanks and bipartisan policy and all kinds of different stuff. But we don't do political canvassing anymore. But I'm still close to that world, and it's still something that I have a hand in. And I guess what I would say is, after doing 10 years of journalism, 5 years of straight politics, and then 5 years of consulting more on policy issues, I just tried to bring that to the book in an honest way. I tried to write the book as a farm boy who wanted to answer these questions, who had a journalism background and who had been around the public policy process enough to maybe know kind of maybe where some of the bodies are buried and how it works a little bit, to be able to be honest about these things. And so that's what my background was. And that's kind of what I brought to as far as perspective to the book.
So this is sort of a tangent, but it's interesting to me that you have this career in journalism, you have this career in family farming. They're both industries that have gone through great turmoil and great change. And so, tangent here, but I'm just curious your take on modern journalism and where you see it headed. Do you think the corporate media, well, how badly do you think they damaged themselves in this last election, and sort of what changes do you see? Do you think this election marked sort of a seismic shift in the media?
Yeah, I joke that I jumped out of one dying industry to, farming, to jump into another one, newspapers, when I was in college. So I don't know I don't know how smart of career decisions I've been making all these years. But no, I think that one of the most precious things that the media, ought to try to protect is its objectivity. And there's been real, obviously, challenges with that for a very long time. And I think that, we're in a place now where the media really has to be careful to make sure that they don't lose further trust from the public, and the public doesn't feel like they're not getting things on the level. And I think that, there's been a real challenge with that is happening at the same time as what I would just call like the fragmentation of media in general. It used to be a couple key outlets kind of set the agenda for better or for worse. And now there's outlets all over the place. And there's podcasts, there's websites, there's all these different outlets. And Wisconsin right now is a good example of that, where you guys uncover a lot of information that other people aren't finding or aren't looking for. or don't know how to get to, depending upon the situation. And so I think that the legacy media and the mainstream media needs to really guard objectivity, and they really need to understand that there are so many places that people can get information from, that it's all fragmented, and they really can't, afford to take the American people for granted. That's kind of my view of it.
Or they should just admit what they are. That's kind of my opinion. You're liberal leaning, you're twisting things, you're going after conservatives harder. So stop pretending you're objective. Either truly try to live out like the notion of objectivity, or at least fairness. Be fairer, or at least just admit what you are. We admit what we are, just admit what you are.
Yeah. Admit you're advocacy journalists. Right.
Yeah. That's the thing, is like, no human being is 100% completely blank slate. No, but like, you can go through the process of like uncovering information and trying to understand different viewpoints of it, and talking to people who are going to disagree with each other about it, and including, you can do that process and have a way to practice journalism in a particular way with integrity. But, I think that a lot of people don't realize that, like, people know, like, readers know. You know what I mean? Like, no, maybe they didn't go to journalism school. No, maybe they can't diagram out for you all the principles of media ethics and stuff. But like, they know if they're being bullshitted. You know what I mean? And I think that we really have to respect the public and readers and viewers, and understand that they know if they're getting things on the level or not. On some level, they instinctively understand if they're kind of being played with.
A lot of the media, I think they've broken their sacred trust with the public. And I am speaking especially of the elite media, because I think some of the hometown newspapers, for example, they still do a good job. For example, the Washington County Daily News, with Jim's recent legislative race, I thought they were very fair, and they did a very good job informing the local community about what was going on in that race and other issues. But the elite media, the Daily Beast, the New York Times, the networks, the MSNBCs, CNNs, they've broken their trust with the public, and I think it's going to be very hard for them to get it back. Switching back though to the family farm issue, there were a couple quotes that you had, and I just wanted to run them by you and have you expand on them. You said the nation's food supply is slipping away. Can you describe what you meant by that?
Yeah, it's on a couple of levels. One is the cost of it, and we talked about why that is. If it's more costly, it's not as attainable, and so it's slipping away in that way. But you also get into the security of our food supply when you talk about the fact that food prices are going up, in part because that food supply chain can be so easily disrupted. And then when you get into the fact that it is also easier for foreign adversaries to buy up our land, so we can't have food that's becoming more expensive and it is more vulnerable to disaster, and it's on land that's becoming more vulnerable to foreign adversaries. We can't have a domestic food supply if we have all those issues continue. And the reality is that right now, as I said, we're wiping out farms at the rate of 45,000 a year on average for a century, at the same time that we have an agricultural trade deficit. We're importing more food than we're exporting. So instead of growing the food that we need in this country and feeding our people, and then whatever is excess selling abroad, we are wiping out our domestic food supply and importing more and more food from other countries. So what happens if there's a massive disaster? What happens if we get into a global conflict with some of those key countries that are feeding us? We could be captive to others, and so it's a domestic food supply issue, just like we need sources of energy, just like we need sources of precious metals, just like we need key industries to be able to secure. We have to have a domestic food supply to be secure as a nation as well.
Brian, go ahead. Yeah, no, I'm interested to know, what was, in writing this book, what was your biggest takeaway, your biggest aha moment when you were done writing it? You're like, wow, that's something that I didn't know and I learned.
Yeah, there were so many of them. The thing that was probably the biggest and most shocking thing to me is just how often we missed the boat and didn't realize what we were doing. Like, I'll give you an example. I know that's a broad thing, but it's just sort of like, how does this happen? A good example is like in the 1980s when we had the farm crisis. Part of what kicked that off is that the government was encouraging more government-backed debt, trying to get farmers to take out more debt because they were trying to get them to get bigger or get out. And then within a few years of that, they increased interest rates because they were trying to control inflation, just like they were doing a couple of years ago. And you can argue for or against. We could have a discussion with people from different political persuasions about whether the government should have been encouraging that debt or not. I think a lot of people that are watching this would probably agree with us that maybe they shouldn't have been doing that. But whether they should have been doing that or not, then when you do that and then you increase interest rates, which there can be a good debate about too, but what you're doing is you're saying to farmers, hey, take out more debt. And then also we're going to make it more expensive overnight. And they literally had farmers taking out millions of dollars of debt and then plunged them underwater overnight. And it's just like shocking, you know what I mean? And what it did for me is it hit that aha moment where I realized that farmers have been pawns in a game for cheap food by both parties for decades. And, you hate to put it that way, but that's the reality when you're making decisions like that, because they're not making those decisions. They're not thinking, they're not wondering what's going to happen to our farmers if we do that. They're thinking about some other type of policy goal. So that's what I realized is just how often we've kind of just screwed things up when we didn't need to. And that was a little shocking to me because I knew that there were a lot of natural market forces that were making farms go by the wayside, a lot of things that some of and I didn't know if I was going to find like anything we could have done differently. And I was shocked at the number of moments where it was just sort of like, we literally just screwed that up and made it worse than it needed to be,
What would you say are the two biggest impediments to the family farm in America or to solving this issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first one is just the soaring costs because they are outpacing the increases in prices if there are increases in prices. That's the first big impediment. And then the second is that we don't have new entrepreneur opportunity for our farmers. So many of them are just trying to figure out how to grow the same types of crops and raise the same types of livestock in more efficient ways and squeeze more and more cost out. And you got to do that. You got to become efficient. You got to figure out how to do that. But we're just in a position where they're just trying to do it cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, basically, because they don't have any new opportunity. When you have a small business and you got something on the shelf that isn't selling anymore, you try to get something on the shelf that is selling. And in this country, because of the lack of places that farmers have to sell new types of crops and products, and because of the way that our government policy works, a lot of farmers don't necessarily see those opportunities in front of them. So we're never going to, and we shouldn't guarantee the ongoing, life and perpetuity of every farm. There's farms that are going to make it and farms that aren't. But the problem is we don't have a rebirth for farms in this country. There aren't, farms go away and it's not like there's a whole lot of new opportunity coming back in. And so we need to address the fact that costs are going up so much for farmers. And we need to address the fact that there really isn't new entrepreneur opportunity where somebody who's milking cows or somebody who's growing corn can't say, hey, you know what, I'm going to experiment with this over here. There aren't enough of those types of opportunities where people can give that a shot, because if they could find a new path to do a different type of farming more easily, you can bet they do it. The resilience of our farm families is incredible. And it's something we talk about a lot in the book. In addition to problems and solutions, it's amazing, but they just don't have those new opportunities for that rebirth.
So how do we do that? How do we encourage those opportunities? Is that something government can help with, or how do we do that?
Yeah, so I think it's a mix of private sector and getting government policy right where we've gotten it wrong. We need a research and development revolution in this country. When they discovered hybrid corn decades ago and realized that you could grow more resilient corn in more places, that opened up huge economic opportunities for new farmers. When they discovered all the things that soybeans can be used for, it opened up huge economic opportunity. Where's our new discovery like that? When are we going to discover like what next crop, what next seed, what next food product can be a sensation across the nation? We haven't had a discovery like that in a very long time. And so we need a research and development revolution that can unleash that and can unleash new private sector innovation. We also, on the government side of things, we also need to make sure that we ensure that our markets are not anti-competitive. And that's internationally, with making sure that any trade we're doing is tough, fair trade that allows our farmers to be on a level playing field with the rest of the world, just like we need for our workers and industries, but also within our domestic economy, making sure that, farms are small businesses, and we need to make sure that small businesses have a shot in the American economy. So I think those are some things that if we can get private sector innovation going and we can make sure that international and domestic markets are actually fair for small businesses and people are getting a fair shot, Those things are really important. There's a lot of government spending that's being wasted because the money isn't going to where it should. The subsidies that are prone to abuse and favoritism. There's a lot of problems with that. So if we can fix those kinds of things and get that stuff right, then the fact that we're living in this moment where people care about where their food comes from more than ever, that's consumer demand that we can try to respond to and try to do something with. And we need more of it, so we need everybody to do a little something. And I always encourage people to say, whether you're voting for a political leader or whether you're trying to decide how to vote with your dollar this weekend when you're going to pick up groceries, try to think about what can I do to create new opportunity for farmers. And I'm not saying you got to go shop at 20 different places, but try to stop off at a local butcher shop in addition to your grocery store. Try to stop off at a farmer's market for some produce, or talk to your grocer and ask them to get local options, because a lot of them are willing to do it if they know that there's demand for it.
Sure.
And just taking steps like that to make it so that there's consumer demand that can create new opportunities for our farmers.
Another quote you said was, you talked about the hollowing out of rural America. Can you talk about what you mean by that?
Yeah, so this goes back to, something that I think is a really deep challenge for our country, which is the farms that at one time were growing ventures in this country. They built our small towns and our rural communities, and so when you lose your farms, which we've been doing for more than a century now, you're losing the farms, and there's all those problems with that we talked about, but you're also endangering those rural communities. There are so many small towns, including the one I grew up in, that have been shrinking every census. There are farms that have disappeared off, or excuse me, there are communities that have disappeared off the map. So you have shrinking communities, you have people leaving rural America, and then you combine with that the more recent decades of job loss of small manufacturers that might have once been in different parts of rural Wisconsin, things like that. And then more recently, inflation. They wonder why people in rural America are so pissed off about what's going on in the in the economy. It's not just that there's inflation, and it's not just that the Rust Belt jobs have gone away. It's that those things came after a century of losing our farms and decades of our communities declining and jobs going away. And so it's a century of economic frustration, not 4 years. It's so deeply ingrained, and it's because of that hollowing out of rural America that's occurring.
Brian, I'm interested to know your stance on the raw milk debate.
Yeah, that's a great question. I grew up with my mom coming down to the cooling tank in the milk house and scooping it right out of there and taking it to the breakfast table. And so I grew up drinking raw milk. And so I think that there are certain standards we need to have safety, of course, but there's a whole market and demand for raw milk, and there are people who can produce it in a way that's safe. And I think that there has to be a way for us to be able to balance these two things. Look, like, we have all of these onerous government regulations, and we still have people getting sick, so it's just like, can't we do better? And so I think we can have smarter policies that can allow for a little bit more free flow of goods, including milk. But again, maybe I'm biased because I grew up drinking it my whole life.
So one of the farmers who I talked about earlier about selling his property, one of the things he was doing with the raw milk is he was making ice cream. And you have not had ice cream until you've had raw, ice cream made out of raw milk. It was the thickest, creamiest, best ice cream I've ever had. And so he always told me I could come over and get gallons of it because, he had all this milk. So that's all he would do all day long is make ice cream. He figured out how to make chocolate chip mint and everything. And it was absolutely delicious.
Oh, I believe it. That's awesome.
I'm curious, this is a tangent too, but when you were talking about raw milk, I thought of one of the controversies in Pennsylvania. To what degree are the Amish keeping farming alive in Wisconsin and other states?
Yeah, it's amazing, actually. The Amish have a lot in common with your average family farm, even though they have, certainly their own ways. But one of the things that they're doing is they are dairy farming, and they're actually doing it successfully on a smaller scale, in part because, they've sort of, they don't do machinery and all the big expensive stuff. And so they do have a lifestyle where they're able to have a much more low cost type of farming. And so there are a lot of Amish farms they're working hard, they're facing hardship for sure, but they're smaller and they've got a little bit of money. and it's partially because their costs are so low, and so it's interesting. I mean, they are a source of good, strong, small family farms, actually. And to your point, in Pennsylvania, they ticked off the Amish in Pennsylvania, and they saw what happened. I mean, they had this
Yeah.
raid of this guy, and I don't know the particulars of the case or anything, but they had this raid of this guy, and the Amish people in Pennsylvania felt like, here we are trying to grind out a living, and the government has got their boot on our neck, and they all of a sudden came out and voted in droves. And I mean, it's a community that doesn't really engage in the outside world a whole lot, and voting is by definition engaging with the outside world. And so I think they kind of shocked people. That was kind of the Amish herd around the world, because it was a important voting block in Pennsylvania.
I
That's
remember
really interesting.
seeing the Amish were
Yeah.
actually holding Trump rallies, right? I mean, going down the road with with their horses and everything. And I mean, how often you ever see that in the history of this country, having a presidential rally by the Amish?
That's
So
Yeah, that's
quite a
amazing.
statement. Yeah.
Yeah, it's quite a time in
Um,
history.
yeah, I guess we want to give you the final word now. Like you said in the summary you sent us, that you want to spark a national conversation with the book. It's obviously getting a lot of reviews, and I read through the reviews. I mean, prominent reviewers saying it's a great book. People should we encourage people to buy it.
Yeah.
So you want to start a national conversation. We'll let you have the final word. Like, what do you want that conversation to be about? What do you want the
Yeah.
narrative to be? What do you want people to know?
Well,
Remember, take away from this.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for your kind words about the book. I guess I hope what people take away from it is that the fact that we have nearly 2 million farms left, and most of them are family farms and many of them are small farms, means that there's so many resilient farm families that are still farming, even though we've made it so hard in this country. And I grew up seeing the hardship of that, and I grew up seeing the beauty of that, seeing calves take their first breaths of life, early in the morning down in the barn with my dad. And so all these farm families are living this difficult way of life, despite how hard we've made it for them. So imagine what they could accomplish if we actually made some changes so that farming was economical for these families again. Imagine what we could accomplish, the problems we could solve: food prices, the health of our food, the security of our food supply. All of these issues could be addressed by the fact that we got all these hardworking families that are just trying desperately to be able to keep on farming. And so, why keep standing in their way? Why not unleash them? And so that's kind of what I hope to leave people with as we have this conversation, because I think there's, we're in a time where we could really make some change, and I hope we do. So
And we'll put the link to your book in the comment thread.
Yep. I
We
did that.
encourage people to buy it. Oh, you did?
I did
Awesome.
that already a couple times. So Brian,
Okay.
Brian,
Okay.
thank you so much for joining us. This was a great conversation. Congratulations on your book, Land Rich, Cash Poor. Great job. I can't imagine
Yeah,
there's
great
more
job.
than a handful of people in this country that could have written that book with, journalism, business journalism, investigative journalism, and then the 4 generations of farm family you grew up with. Really, how many other people could have done this? So congratulations.
Well, and you've got the knowledge of policy and,
Yeah.
politics and public policy and how that all works, like how government sort of actually functions behind the scenes.
Yeah.
So I
Well,
agree.
I really appreciate it, guys. We tried to tell an honest story on the personal side, and we tried to be even-handed
Yeah.
and comprehensive in the rest of it. And anybody who picks it up, it's available on Amazon, or at bookstores nationwide. And anybody who grabs Land Rich, Cash Poor, I appreciate it. And I guess I just hope that we can keep the conversation going and see what we can do about this. So I appreciate you guys having me on.
Thanks, Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks. I think we're still live.
I know I'm ending it.